welcome back to those who've joined from the first couple rounds. Excited to be sharing with you step 3 or key number 3 in this journey to select the best ERP or CRM solution today. So today we're going to be talking about the implementer or the implementation partner. If you choose to implement yourself or with a partner, we'll talk about what you should look for in finding the right partner for you. So as Leah mentioned, my name is Eric Newell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Stoneridge Software. I've been doing ERP and CRM support and services and sales for the past 21 years, with Microsoft for 13 years, and then now a little over 8 years with Stoneridge Software. My expertise is on project management, and I'm the author of a forthcoming book called Mastering Microsoft Dynamics Implementations, which should be out this spring. It's got an ISBN number now, and so it's getting close to being completely finalized. And so looking forward to sharing that with folks this spring when that comes out. So let's dive into it. Again, the goal for the series is to provide some ideas on what to look for in a solution and how to conduct a thorough evaluation so you select the right software for your business and your business needs. And just to remind you, this is a very big decision. It can have an impact on your organization for many years to come. So why is it important? Because it's going to be the brains of your system strategy for many years. This is going to be the platform that you're going to need to connect with all of your other line of business applications with. So here it's also going to be an expensive and difficult implementation, and you need to make sure that you've picked the right partner to make it as least to limit that as much as possible. So that's why we're talking about implementer today, and that has such a big impact on how that implementation process goes. And there's just a ton of change management that comes with this project that you'll need to work through with your organization. So we'll talk a little bit today about about the importance of having your team ready to go for an implementation. Well, it's also an important decision, and we'll talk about how to do that right. So setting the parameters, choosing these 4 keys and making them a big part of the parameters that you use to make this decision, involving a cross-sectional team like we talked about in part 1, and then making sure your decision maker is part of the process. Those are some of the keys to do this right and make sure that you make the right selection. So again, the 4 keys that we talk about are the fit. So is this solution a good fit for the requirements that you have in the industry that you're in? The platform is what we talked about last time. So is this the right technology platform that's going to integrate well with the other parts of your business and what you use today? Is it something that's supportable? Is it something that you can connect? Is it something familiar to your team, to your IT team, and to your users that they're going to be able to adopt it more quickly? Kind of thinking about it in the change management standpoint. So today we'll talk about the implementer, and then coming up next Tuesday, we'll talk a little bit about the costs, what costs go into a project, what you should look for on a cost standpoint, and what's too much and too little. So without further ado, let's dive into the implementer. So the implementer, again, some clients in the past have tried to implement business application software on their own. It's not something I recommend. Maybe if you're doing QuickBooks, that you could get that implemented on your own. But I really think you need to work with a professional who does this all day, every day, if you're going to try to get the results out of it that you want. So we're going to go with the assumption that you're going to try to find a partner to implement this with you. So I'll be kind of hitting on this throughout today's, but there are really 5 key evaluation points that I think you should be thinking about when you are deciding who the right implementer is for you. And I'll talk more detail about this, but what is their implementation plan? So how is the implementation going to work? What are some tools that you're going to use to make sure that it's successful? How are you going to measure the progress of it? How are you going to know that you're really on track as part of the implementation? You want to have those conversations up front before you choose the right implementer. You want to know that this implementer has some experience in your industry, that they know some of the key terms that you're going to use. That to me is maybe less important, but it is still something you want to be thinking about. You wouldn't certainly want to, if you're a manufacturing company, work with somebody who implements dental solutions all the time. You want them to have some familiarity with your industry. And then you also have to think, if they do have less experience in your industry, how can you help educate them, or how can you be clear about what you need so that there aren't gaps there? The key part of it, though, is platform experience. They really need to know how the solution that they're implementing works. So if you pick a solution, let's say you pick Intact and that's the solution that you want to use, and you're working with a partner who has implemented NetSuite and Dynamics in the past, they aren't going to be familiar with all the configurations and flags that you can put in place in an Intact implementation. That's probably not the right partner for you if they don't have a lot of experience in that platform. So I value the platform experience more than the industry experience, just because then they know how the software works and they know what things that you can flip on or off. I've seen many instances in my career in Dynamics where a partner who hasn't had experience with F&O, for example, says that they can do an implementation and it goes very wrong. So platform experience is really an important thing, and you need to ask your implementer, the people who are going to be on your projects, what is their experience with that platform. You also want to look for a partner who has some depth. You want to ask them, how many resources do they have in this particular practice? There are some small implementers out there who do a great job, but they may only have 1 or 2 people. It may be easy for them to get distracted, or another project comes up that they have to spend time on. So you want to know like who all is going to be brought to bear on this implementation. And if there were to be some problem or somebody within the organization leaves, how can you make sure that they have a backfill or someone who can help support that person? Because that is one of the risks that you manage in implementations, is anybody leaving the project, whether that's somebody on your side from a client team perspective or an implementation partner resource leaving as well. Those can have big ripple effects on implementations. You want to make sure that if that were to happen, that there is somebody that could be plugged in within that organization. Otherwise, you just put yourself in a big amount of risk there. And then finally is just getting a sense of the fit that they have with your team. So I think it's important for the implementation team collectively, including the partner and the client team members who will be working on it, to get together as part of the road mapping exercise or whatever it might be as part of the implementation, to make sure that they're all going to be able to work together well. So it could be another thing to think about here too is offshore implementations. So if you're working with a team that's offshore, there might be time challenges, there might be culture, language challenges that might not be the best fit for the team that you're working with. So I like to tell this story, but I'll just tell it here up front. But we were working with a client or prospect a few years ago, and they had 6 different implementation options that they were looking at, and we were one of them. And we had positioned the project at about $550,000, and so did 4 of the other 5 implementation, different software options. And then there was one that came along and they proposed a $175,000 project. So the customer went with the $175,000 project. They didn't ask any questions about what the implementation team was going to look like, how it was going to be done, anything like that. Well, it turns out the way that they could make this work for $175,000 is it was going to be fully implemented by a remote team in India. And it was basically going to be sending out a list of questions to the customer. The customer responds, sends it back. The Indian team configures it, and then they have to they send you a bunch of generic training materials, and then you're supposed to train your team and go live with that. Well, they didn't ask the first question about what the implementation team was going to look like when they agreed to this cheap rate of doing the implementation. And as you can imagine, that did not go well. They ended up throwing out the project and never got it implemented using that process. So this is just one example of not thinking about or even asking any questions about what the implementation process is going to look like, who's going to do it, how much time are they going to be on site. That's something we'll talk a little bit about as well. That to me isn't a key part of the evaluation point because that's usually negotiable, and I want to give you some ideas on how you can negotiate that with your partner and what the right answer is for how much time should be spent on site. So these are kind of the 5 things that I'll kind of go back to, but I want to talk more specifically about what the implementation plan looks like. So, but before we jump into that, I want to talk about the how ready the groups are, or you are, for the implementation. So I've kind of built this chart, and this isn't necessarily a scientific chart, it's just based on my experience. But if you look at it, it's kind of a matrix. On the left side, there's the implementation team quality, high, medium, or low. And then on the top, there's the customer readiness for implementation, high, medium, or low. And so you have to really be thinking about how ready are you for that implementation. So I've talked about this in some other webinars in the past that I can share with you as well too, but there's a whole step of activities that you should do before you begin a project, and that focuses on cleaning up your data, focuses on identifying your processes that are in scope, a big focus on who is going to be involved with the project from your team's perspective and what roles do they have. There's the budget, which we'll talk about a little bit more next time. But and then just the change management efforts too. So if you think about those pieces, those are the things you need to be ready with before you even engage vendors and really start talking about the implementation project. So if you approach an implementation and you have a low amount of readiness, like you haven't really thought about the budget, you haven't cleaned up any of your data, you don't have your processes identified, you don't really know what's going to be in scope, and you work with a poor quality partner, the project has no chance of success. It's just not going to succeed. You shouldn't do it. Go save your money and spend it on getting ready or spend it on something else, because it's just not going to work. Now, if you are not ready for the project and you pick a average, medium level implementation partner, it's probably still not going to work. It may get done, but it's probably going to be twice as expensive and twice as long as you originally anticipated, because they're going to run into all sorts of data problems. You're going to have all sorts of battles on what's in scope and what's out of scope, and both parties are going to leave this marriage upset. You're not going to be happy with the implementation partner. They're not going to be happy of working with you. So if you're not ready and you have an adequate but not great partner, it's just going to be a bad experience, and it may or may not even be successful. Now, if you are not ready and you partner with a really strong partner, the implementation will get done. It's just going to take a lot longer than you expected, because again, you're going to run into data problems that are going to slow things down and cause potential bugs that might not really be code bugs. There's going to be a lack of decision making and who's in charge, so decisions are going to take longer to be made than they should. You're not necessarily going to have scope nailed down, so there are going to be fights over scope throughout the implementation as well too. So your partner will help you work through those things, but they can't make those decisions for you. So anticipate more budget than you expected, more time than you expected if you're not ready. Now, sorry, clicked the wrong button there. So if you're in a decent spot, if you're have given some thought to how your implementation is going to go, and you work with a partner who isn't very good, the project is still likely to fail. What might happen if you're decently ready but your partner is poor, you might end up changing partners midstream. But again, your project's going to be over time and over budget. Now, if you're medium ready, you work with an adequate partner, project will likely get done, but it's going to be over time and over scope. There's just going to be issues that come up on both ends that are going to drag the project on. Now, if you're decently ready and you work with a great partner, the implementation will be successful. It might be slightly over time, over budget due to data quality or scope issues or lack of decision making, but generally you're going to be able to get there. And then the best situation, obviously, is if you are highly ready for the implementation. But honestly, if you're highly ready for the implementation and you work with a poor partner, the project will get done, but you're going to have to do all the heavy lifting on the project, or you're going to end up replacing the partner on the project. So I see that happen a fair amount, and it is still a scenario if you end up picking the wrong partner to begin with, even if you've done the right things to be ready for that project. Now, if you've done all the right things and you work with a solid but not spectacular partner, the project's going to get done, probably over budget, probably over time. Some of your success criteria, things that you might want to get done, just might not get done due to inefficiencies from your partner standpoint. So obviously what we're all hoping for is the top left box here, where you're highly ready for the implementation and you pick a great partner. Those are the implementations that are going to be done on time, on budget, and with your objectives met. But as you can see, if you think about stats on implementation success, 60% of projects are over time, over budget. Well, why is that? It's because the team is not ready for the implementation and you didn't pick the right partner. And that's why so many different cases can lead to the project not going well. So I want to actually take a minute and do a quick poll and just ask you from your perspective, how ready were you for past implementation that you've done? All right, Leah, do you have some results for us?
Yes, it's a little bit of everything. About 14% not at all ready. 29% had a team but no real plan. 43% had a team but not a great plan, and 14% very ready.
Great. Well, hopefully the very ready folks are proving my theory right and we're able to be successful on it. And for everyone else, I hope it's an opportunity to learn on more about the importance of having a good plan in place and how that can help you in the future. So let's talk a little bit now more about what the plan looks like and the plan that your partner is going to suggest to you for how the implementation works. So there's two kind of groups of methodologies that you typically find in any kind of IT project, but especially on ERP or CRM projects. So there's the waterfall methodology. So the waterfall methodology is kind of the classic way to implement software. It's a very step-by-step process. So you start with your diagnostic, next you do your analysis or your requirements gathering. Once you've done all your requirements gathering, then you move to design. You design the system all together. Then after all the design is done, you move to development and you code whatever needs to be done. And after that's all done, you move to deployment and then you go live. So the waterfall is the approach that was really common in Dynamics, especially up till the early 2010, 2015 even range. So Microsoft produced a implementation methodology that they called SureStep that I was involved in actually back when I was at Microsoft, and I used to teach the class on how to use SureStep to do implementations. But unfortunately, there are some elements of that are helpful, but as a general rule, it leads to longer implementations and more expensive implementations. So Agile or Scrum or any variety of that is kind of the more common process that's used today. So Agile was started with this Agile manifesto. 17 folks got together and they put together their 4 key principles and 12 goals of how to implement software. So this is using sprints, and chunking out pieces of the implementation, and it's a more iterative model. So Agile is a great solution for most things that you do in IT today. It has some challenges in a big ERP project just because there are so many dependencies, and you really want to start with those core master data elements like your customer definition, your item definition, your employee definition, your vendor definition. All of those things really need to be figured out. Your account definition, all those things really need to be figured out before you get too far in the implementation. So what we've done at Stone Ridge is we've developed what we call a process-centric implementation. So it is primarily derived from the Agile approach, or we use Agile throughout the process, but we do have some elements that are a little bit more waterfall-like, where it comes down to making sure that we've mapped out the activities and the dependencies that they have in them so that we can move through it in a way that makes a lot of sense for an ERP or a CRM implementation. So you'll want to know from the implementation partner that you're working with, how do you plan to attack this? So you're going to do it in waterfall, you're going to do it in Agile. Do you have a hybrid version of it, which is kind of what our process centric is, and I've heard other partners and implementers using that hybrid model as well too. So have them explain what is their methodology, how they plan to attack it. If they plan to do a waterfall approach, I would be a little bit nervous about that because it's really hard to manage a waterfall approach. If they want to do an Agile approach, then have them talk to you about how they are going to make sure that things are done in the proper order. And if they've got a hybrid approach, ask them to explain how that works and what elements of waterfall and Agile they're going to put together to make sure it works for you. And then what you want to see as part of your implementation conversations before you make the software selection is you want to see what their project roadmap looks like. So what steps are going to happen during the implementation, and how is that going to get you to live at a time that works well for your business and then makes reasonable sense. And it's, one of the big challenges that I see from the implementation partner side is that a lot of times customers have a date in mind that they want to get the project done. And that just causes all sorts of problems and pressure on the implementation. It's good to have an aggressive date. I totally think that that's the way you want to approach it, but you want to make sure that you build out all the steps that you want to have in the implementation before you figure out what the date is. So the best way to go about creating the right date for your implementation is to say, here are the elements that are going to be happen during to get you there. So just be wary of implementation partners that say, yeah, I can get you live in 2 months, or I can get you live in 6 months. Say, okay, great. What are the elements? How are we going to get there? Show me a map of what we're going to do when to make sure that we can get it there. So I really encourage you to ask for a sample timeline as part of the implementation, so you can know what elements are going to be included in there. CRPs are an important thing for you to really get your team and your hands on the software. So CRP is a conference room pilot. And I think that really helps with change management and the overall success of the project. If they're trying to cut corners, there's probably not going to be a CRP. Is that something you want? If so, fine. You're taking a little bit more of a risk in the implementation, but if you want to save cost and don't think that's important, then that's fine too. But you want to have these conversations with the implementer and make sure you have the implementer that most best fits what you want to get done, and make sure that they have a comprehensive plan for it that gives reasonable enough amount of time for each of the steps that need to occur within the project. Another couple things that I think you should ask for is understanding what sprints are and whether or not you're going to be using sprints on a project. So anything using an agile methodology or a hybrid methodology is going to use a sprint. And a sprint is just time-boxed iterations that can be 2 or 4 weeks. Most of the time they're 2 weeks, but it's the amount of work that's going to get done during a period of time. And what sprints do is it gives you a chance to see, it gives first the implementation partner a chance to lay out all the activities, and then it gives you a chance to see how well are you moving towards getting done. In the waterfall approach, it's really hard to know how close you are to done. You can say I have a deadline for the analysis phase or a deadline for the design phase, but there's not really a good system for keeping track of has everything actually been done. If you take that and you put those into sprints, you know every 2 weeks what's supposed to be done. And sprints also give you the opportunity to make sure you're assigning a task to people who have the capacity to do it. So if you've got a controller who's working on your project and they've decided I can dedicate 20 hours a week to this project, well, you give them 20 hours a week or less of tasks. That's another problem that happens if you don't have sprints, is you end up tasking people with a whole bunch of things and they don't have time to do that. And so things don't get done. So a sprint cycle is just a 2-week cycle where you do planning at the beginning, you do daily stand-ups every day to check in on the progress, and then at the end you do a review to see how well you did, and then a retrospective to see what you can do better the next time that you do a sprint. So I highly recommend, if you really want to know what's going on with your implementation, that you should use sprints. And so ask them these questions: are you planning to use sprints? How are we going to know that we're on track to get this done on time? Another thing that I learned actually from the construction business is this concept of earned value. So I think it's a great idea to ask your implementer, how are you going to track progress on the implementation? And one of the best ways to do that is earned value. So what earned value is basically, if you look at the green line here, that's your planned value. So that is the planning that you do originally in the project that says, okay, we're going to have this much done by this time and it's going to cost X. So you map that out at the beginning of the project, and that's how you associate that to your budget. So if you have a $200,000 budget for the project, you break it out into each of the sprints and say, okay, at the end it's going to cost $200,000. And then what you do is then you compare your actual cost to that planned cost. So now that I'm 6 weeks into the project, have I spent $60,000? So let's say it's $20,000 a week for 10 weeks. I've spent $75,000, through 6 weeks into the project. Now I'm going, sorry, I think I mixed up my math there. But let's say you're over budget at that point. Now you can say, well, how am I going to catch up, and how am I going to make sure that I end with the right amount of budget, or am I going to have to do a change request and ask for more money already? And then, so that's one line you want to manage. And then you also want to manage the earned value, which the earned value is basically, did you get the stuff done that you said you planned to get done during those times? And if you're behind on that, then you know your project's not going to go live on time. So if you really want to make sure your project goes live on time, ask your implementer if they have a means of tracking that. And the best way to do this is this tool that we learned from construction, which is managing that earned value. So if the earned value and planned value stay in sync, great, then you're on time. And if the earned value, actual cost, and planned value are all in sync, great, you're going to be on time, on budget. That's what you want to be able to achieve. But if your implementation partner has no means of measuring this, or this is a foreign concept to them, then you just know that as you go into this implementation, you're not going to know where you are. You're not going to know as you go through the process if you're going to be on time or on budget, and you're going to have to put complete trust in your partner's hands to help you get there. So now let's switch and talk a little bit about what are you paying for with an implementation partner. So what are the roles that are involved in it? So typically, or in certain cases, you'll have an executive sponsor. Executive sponsor is not a role you necessarily pay for. That is the person at the implementation partner who's a leader in that organization and is ultimately responsible for everything going well. That's the person that you want to interface with your executive sponsor within your organization, whether that's your CEO or CIO or vice president or whatever it might be. But then the roles that are more actively involved in the project on a daily basis. So the engagement manager is typically the person from the implementation partner who is responsible for the day-to-day activities or for making sure the project is successful. So they are involved in steering committee meetings, they're involved in planning meetings, and their job is to make sure the right resources are on the project, that you're getting what you expect from the project, and they're kind of providing a supervisory role to the team as well as to budget and earn value and things like that. So they're not full-time on projects typically, but they are someone that will be intimately knowledgeable about what's going on. Now the project manager is going to be the resource who lays out that project schedule that I showed you, and they're the ones who are going to be managing the budget. They're managing the scope and doing change requests if those need to be done, managing the risks and risk register issues list. They're going to be managing the task completions, making sure everything gets done. A lot of times they're going to be taking notes and following up with action items and meetings that they're involved in. So they're going to be heavily involved in the project, just making sure that the project stays on track. So their job is to have, no wasted time. A project manager should think about that being their job in an implementation. And you're going to have a functional leader, so sometimes that's called a solution architect or solution delivery manager, but that's basically the functional person who is going to make sure that the implementation all comes together and works well. So they sometimes are involved in a particular area like supply chain or marketing or certain things like that if you're talking about a CRM solution, but generally their job is to just make sure that all the pieces are coming together and make sense. They're typically involved in some of those master record discussions around customers, vendors, parts, things like that. Then you have a functional consultant or potentially multiple functional consultants. So their job is to focus in a particular area. So on an ERP project, you would have a finance focused person, maybe a supply chain focused person, maybe a manufacturing, maybe project if you're doing project accounting. But that would be the person responsible for making sure that part of the system works well. And they're going to be the ones on site more often and interfacing with your team members quite a bit. A technical consultant, and as we get more and more cloud based, their on-site presence gets less and less necessary, but their job is to basically make sure that the system, you have the right environments, that the code can move between the environments, that the security is right in the environments, that the performance is going to work well in the environments. Their job is to take care of kind of all of the non-functional things to make sure that the system is going to work. Then you've got developers, and they're going to be the ones doing the custom code, custom integrations, custom reporting work. And sometimes you'll have a QA or quality assurance resource who will be responsible for organizing the testing and making sure you have proper test cases and a test execution plan on your project. And then after the implementation is done, you're going to transition over to a support team. So it's sometimes good to know the support engineers who are going to be helping with that project, once it gets to go live. So don't be surprised if you see roles like this on your implementation partner roster. You're going to want to make sure you have a good relationship with the engagement manager, get an understanding of who the project manager and solution architect or solution delivery manager, because they're going to be the ones really running the project and making sure that you're going to be successful. So another question that people like to ask and I like to talk about is, how much time should your implementation team be on site versus remote? So I like to think of it this way. Everyone's going to have their own opinion. I mean, the better prepared you are for an implementation, the less time your implementation partner needs to be there. If you feel like you're going to need a ton of hand-holding for your team members, then you're probably going to want to have the implementation team there more often. So what are some of the benefits of having the team on site? So first, it just helps develop strong relationships. Building up that trust between the two parties is really key to success in the project. It helps the implementation team to get to know the business better, so they understand what your warehouses look like and how you're moving data physically, or moving things physically between different locations. They get a better understanding of that, so they can make sure the solution covers those things you maybe forgot to say, but are really a part of your process. I think whiteboarding sessions and kind of design conceptual ideas when you're bouncing ideas off each other, that's a lot easier to do in person than it is to do remotely. It still can be done, but again, there's benefits in that. And then when you get to training or CRP sessions or train the trainer sessions, it's really helpful to have someone on site to be in the room, to be able to walk around and see if people are following instructions well. These are all things that can be done remotely, and given the pandemic that we've had dealing with here for the past 11 months, certainly we've figured ways to do these things and do these things successfully. But that doesn't take away from the fact that these things are easier to be done if they're done on site. What are some things that are benefits of having the team work remotely? Well, first off, there are certain activities that just don't need to happen on site. So like development, you don't need developers there on site at your location. The functional resources should be doing the designs, and they should be handing off the development to a developer. So there's really not a reason that developers should need to come on site. And tech consultants as well too, with everything being done in the cloud, they can access the environments from wherever, so it's not as important for them to be on site. And design activities, so when you've got a functional consultant who's going to spend 8 hours writing up a design document, it just doesn't make sense for them to necessarily be sitting in a cube at your location doing that type of work. So those are ways where I don't think there's any value in them being on site for some of those activities. And the big reason you want to do more things remote is significant cost savings. So anywhere from 15 to 20% of an implementation cost can be on just on-site time. Now, I would say that was more of how it worked in 2000 to 2015, 2018. I think people have started to find that you can do more things remotely, and I think post-pandemic, that's certainly going to be more of the model. And then there's also just puts more weight and puts more onus on the team to own the project. And ultimately, you're going to own this system as the customer. So you need to make sure that your team understands the gravity of it. And one thing that you can start to rely on is your partner, walks you through everything. You think they're going to be there forever doing that. Well, you can't afford to pay those rates over and over again for the next 20 years. You've got to build up your team to be able to do it. So that's one of the benefits of being remote, is it does put a little more pressure on your team to really own things. So I hope that helps as you think about the decision of how much time should be on site versus remote. So now we're kind of coming to the end of it. So just to think about the impact of the implementer, like what happens if you don't consider the implementation partner as you're making the decision? So your team's just not going to work well with the implementer. I mean, there's always, challenges personality-wise, and when people feel strongly about one way or another, and those can lead to a lot of tension and frustration. It's important that the team gets along. If you've never asked any questions about the implementer, don't know who they are, they might not work well together. And then if you choose an implementer who doesn't have experience with the product or with the industry, you're going to end up delaying the project because there's just going to be inefficiencies in the way they operate. Now, if you only consider the implementer, and really that pretty much never happens, but every once in a while you run into somebody who's had a great experience with another implementer and says, I want to work with them and I don't care what product it is. That's the only time I've really ever seen that. But if that's the case, then you might ignore the other factors. You might not pick the right product, or it might not be a great platform and well integrated with what you're doing. But with that, thank you.